Hi friends, host Eric here. Nicholas is here with me as well. As always, Nick and I have some interesting conversations, and we were having an interesting one a little while ago about understanding purpose and how to present ideas and stuff like that. And it reminded me of a video I wanted to make for quite some time now, which is to talk about how to think about argumentation or how to approach it from a strategic standpoint using a clear example. And I did a really good job, I felt, the last time with my LD debater who won the tournament with these LD cases, and I think that they're very instructive as to how to deal with framing and other issues regarding a resolution. So the resolution here is resolved in the United States, national service ought to be compulsory. In the United States, national service ought to be compulsory. So on its surface, it's a draft case. In South Korea, for example, everybody has to serve in the military. In Germany, everybody has to have some kind of national service. There's a couple incarnations of it in various places around the world. And the reality is, I oppose the notion because it interferes with autonomy, but I have to argue both sides. So when I'm approaching this resolution in the United States, all right, so that's not much you can do with that. You could try to play something tricky definitionally with that, but not really much you can do with that, so just leave that alone. National service ought to be compulsory. National service is the part where you can really get a lot of ground in. In the most literal sense, it's like some sort of providing community service kind of a thing, or like I said, the draft. In the United States, there used to be a civil service under Theodore Roosevelt that built bridges and dams and stuff like that. But the United States haven't had any kind of compulsory national service since the draft in World War II, I believe. And we do have selective service, which means they can reinstitute the draft if they feel they need to, they being military government, but it's unlikely to happen. So, okay, the one thing I would actually talk about my personal beliefs that I kind of think is not a terrible idea is if you're going to have compulsory national service, compulsory military national service makes a little bit of sense because it makes the military more reflective of the ideational diversity of the population rather than just yahoos who want to be in the military. All right, but let's go forward. And I
want to talk about that.
All right.
Because at the same time, you don't want a ton of diversity in the military. Like they have a hard cutoff for if you have a IQ of 83 and below, which is 10% of the population, then the diminishing returns make it to where you're not even, like, better for you not to be. You're serving.
Okay, well, I don't mind excluding people on various disabilities or extremely low intelligence or whatever else. I'm not saying that.
But that's the thing that people don't. When we talk about equality, we don't take it to its. What do you mean by that? And take it to.
Okay, well, the point is, it's irrelevant what I think about this. I'm saying that if we're going to have a military that goes and fights and dies, there are two models. One is voluntary, and all voluntary military like we have, and the other is compulsory. And I'm saying that there are advantages to a compulsory military. It makes us less likely to go fight in wars, for one thing. It's not just our professional military service, which is what it is. It's a actual representation of the community. But I'm willing to be swayed to the opposite perspective on that. I'm not attached to that position. And that's what it means to think strategically about argumentation is I've got to argue this case on both sides, aff and neg, regardless of what I think. So I want to start with the neg side because it sets up well for explaining the aff side. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. But the bottom line is, the way I thought about it was, the issues for the affirmative are going to be the compulsion, because you have to defend compulsion, using force to make people do things they don't want to do. You have to argue that it's desirable and beneficial because in the long term, the outcomes for society outweigh the harms of the individual. So the compulsion issue is your tricky spot to get over when you're on the aff. The other thing is national service. Somebody could argue that there's something wrong with the nation state as a status of thing, and so we don't want to support the nation state in any sense of the word. We want to do things that destabilize nationalism and return us to some sort of globalist framework that incorporates localism or something like that. You could argue any number of things on aff. So when I'm thinking about it strategically and I want to affirm this resolution, what I want to do is affirm it in a way that avoids the strongest neg arguments. The strongest neg argument is compulsion, and the second strongest neg argument is nation. I'm not going to worry about the nation one now because that's going to require a discourse K on their part of some sort, or an anti-imperialist K or something like that, which I feel more well equipped to deal with. So let's talk about the compulsion thing. How do we get around compulsion on the national service topic? Well, what I decided to do was have us run this case here, and I'll go through it and you'll see what it is. The core message of section 1 of this, there's an outline up here, but the core message of section 1 is the AF has misascribed to the nation a status as a moral actor and thus has failed to affirm this resolution. Argument 1. In affirming, they are making a normative claim because the resolution says ought to, and our definition of normative is consistent with the claim made by the resolution. Definition: normative. In economics and philosophy, a normative statement expresses a value judgment of whether a situation is desirable or undesirable. It looks at the world as it should be. The world would be a better place if the moon were made of green cheese. Is a normative statement because it expresses a judgment about what ought to be. Normative statements are characterized by the modal verbs should, would, could, or must. Should and ought to are both modal verbs. In most cases, should and ought to are used interchangeably today. There's a slight difference in meaning. Should is used when we want to express our subjective opinion. Ought to is used when we want to express an objective truth. Interesting distinction, right? Definition of locutionary we also put here in the top framework to make sure we've got our ground covered. Relating or being the communicative effect, such as commanding or requesting of an utterance. I use the word a little differently than that, but that's a technical definition of it. Argument 2. The normative claims regarding the state of the nation are not claims regarding an object that is subject to that sort of locutionary analysis. So, locutionary, as opposed to illocutionary, is not about the purpose of your communication, but rather the content of your communication. Brubaker 2004. Tag: because nationality is an ontological claim, either self-identified or other imposed, it's not possible to speak meaningfully of a nation without establishing the individual to whom that status is being conferred. Brubaker A. The nationhood is not an ethno-demographic or ethno-cultural fact. It is a political claim. It is a claim on people's loyalty, on their attention, on their solidarity. If we understand nationhood not as a fact but as a claim, then we can see that nation is not a purely analytical category. It is not used to describe a world that exists independently of the language used to describe it. It is used rather to change the world, to change the way people see themselves, to mobilize loyalties, kindle energies, and articulate demands. So this guy, Brubaker, he wrote an article that I found cards to support my position with. Brubaker B. The AF speaks of a nation as though it were a group or community that exists. Instead, a nation is a claim upon individuals. Their failure to make the distinction renders it impossible for them to affirm. Brubaker B. How does the category nation work? Putting the question this way displaces our everyday understanding of nations as collectives, entities, communities. It suggests that we should start instead by considering nation as a category, a term, and nationalism as a particular language, a political idiom, a way of using that word or category. Analysis. My opponent's normative claims are misapplied here. A nation is neither clearly enough defined, nor does it have moral agency, and thus claims predicated on such assumptions cannot stand. Alright, so if we go up here to argument 3. If we accept the AF's assumption that the nation is an object of analysis, we are left with an amorphous and undefined thing around which no meaningful work can be done. Brubaker C. We might say that the nation is, in the first instance, a category of practice, not a category of analysis. I want to make the category nation the object of analysis rather than use it as a tool of analysis. I ask not what is a nation, but how does a nation work as a category of practice, a political idiom, a claim? What does it mean to speak in the name of a nation, and how should one assess the practice of doing so? Is this a practice that can be defended and that should be cultivated, or is it at best anachronistic, at worst a dangerous practice? I will not attempt to give a general answer to these normative questions, for I do not think a compelling general answer can be given.
I want to try and give one.
Nation is used to do too wide a variety of work in too wide a range of contexts. Okay, so go ahead, Nick. Nick's going to try to rebut argument 3 here that says that a nation is a category of practice, not a category of analysis, not the object of analysis.
What was some of your other claims?
Well, let me continue then. I've got normative extension here. Lawler 2005D. If we attempt to interpret nations as agents, the real-world data belies our false assumption, as shown when shared moral standards justify wildly different behaviors. Lawler D. All Western states declared themselves to be motivated by varying degrees of humanitarian concern. Nonetheless, they differed sometimes widely, either between themselves or with their own public with regard to the content of their internationalism or its practical implications, especially the appropriateness of deploying deadly force in the name of humanitarian values. Key to this differentiation were overlapping disputes about such things as the legality of the resort to war, the need to secure prior formal approval, the credibility of the findings of UN-appointed arms inspectors, and the merits of exhaustively pursuing other pathways to changing the internal and external conduct. Alright, so then there's an additional extension here from Lawler that says, Normative claims applied to nation states are misdirectional claims actually made by interest groups. When communitarianism is applied to international politics, it can easily be read as merely an apologia for self-regarding statism and international moral relativism. Sovereign states remain the key actors in international politics since no decisive logic of global transformation can be discerned, even if the prevalence of chronic global inequity or horrific forms of large-scale violence generates widespread demands that something be done, be it by the international community or individual states. International public opinion carries little force. Little or no international community exists beyond rhetoric, and the idea of states acting in response primarily to moral dictates is usually tainted by egoistic self-interest. When states claim to be acting in a cosmopolitan-minded manner, realism suggests that this is more likely to reflect concerns about prestige or image or hard interests, which are convenient to subsume under the category of humanitarian.
Well, there's been a lot of research done on disgust, sensitivity, and conservatism. And in that, we like to protect against unwanted thoughts or filth or what have you. They're all about borders. They want borders around things. They want things protected, so prevent from bad ideas or contagion. And the other is that of being open to, like a liberal standpoint is we should have no borders. We should not.
It doesn't work like that.
But that
liberalism and conservatism don't align like that.
Well, deep down at the core, that what they a big part, yeah.
Really,
want to have no.
Liberalism is particularist, and conservatism tends to be universalist, which means liberalism is concerned about the well-being of the individual people. Okay, now this may take a general well-being-ish kind of political bent because they don't understand that their legitimate valuing of the well-being of people doesn't provide any support for the advocacy that they're making. It just is, it means it's authentically sourced. But conservatives, on the other hand, think that their general rules are sufficient to ignore sometimes or to even countervalue the people who are impacted negatively. In neither case do those things justify their advocacy.
They want to protect tradition. It's not that one side's right or the other one's wrong. They're both right. They're both wrong. They're both needed to balance out to where you get somewhere in the middle where we do that.
No, that's not at all the solution. The solution is not middle ground. Okay, the solution is not they're both right and both wrong. The solution is nobody understands what matters if they're fixated on the correctness of their advocacies. They need to be fixated on the correctness of their argumentation. If they are, then they won't be making bad advocacies because over time they'll understand that those things can't be sustained because there's too steep a rhetorical slope. So,
but that is what if you say okay, we need to both protect our tradition, our borders, and our nationalism. When that is properly balanced with we need to have open borders, let anybody who wants to come here, and the whole reason they're coming here is because
those values aren't policy prescriptions.
But then what happens when both people are creating arguments from those points of view? You get somewhere meeting in the middle where yes, you do have an army, but you're not drafted in the army whenever we need to deploy troops.
But look,
we do have a strong army, so they're like, well, we need to pay him.
Okay, but look, here's the thing: the advocacy politically is different from the value that motivates it. In other words, you can have claim to metaphysical statuses that don't confer any justification to physical actions, or some do. And the process of conferring legitimacy and determining legitimacy is the important part. I can lay claim to metaphysical statuses, and if I can defend those statuses, then I can proceed possibly to use those to justify some sort of action. But I have to understand the mechanics by which those justifications occur and the burdens that are implicit in whatever you've already advocated. So it's like if I'm trying to follow up changing this advocacy into an action, then I am required to use the same sort of justifications. I can't change justifications all of a sudden and say, okay, now that we've got you to agree with it, let's figure out how to do it using entirely utilitarian justifications without considering the principlist objections that we agreed upon prior to taking action in the first place. So in other words, if I agree to resolve some problem in a non-rights violating way, that doesn't mean that when we switch over to solving the problem directly in terms of the actual policy prescription that we accept a rights violating way, because somehow the legitimacy of any action is justified by legitimizing a specific action. That's the mistake, okay? So, look, the point is, in this instance, what I do after we do the discourse K on the nature of the word nation and what it is, it's a rhetorical claim rather than an object of analysis, I provide Grace these government coercion bad cards, a whole bunch of cards that say about how coercion...
It's a metaphysical object of analysis.
However, you're right. Now, I want to stress this here, but what I'm saying is bad is coercion. And I'm saying that coercion is an object of analysis. That coercion itself, as an object of analysis, can be analyzed, and we can derive conclusions about our prescriptive validations from our normative validations in this fashion. That we ought to be driven by our normative validations. And I've got a number of arguments as to why if it gets down to that.
Can you define normative?
A normative claim is one that says we ought to do something regardless of whether it's in our best interest. It might be in my best interest to steal some money, let's say. And depending on how you frame out best interest, you could argue yes or you could argue no. But let's assume I am in a situation where I have a very low likelihood of getting caught. And it's a substantial amount of money, and let's say I need it. And you might argue, on the one hand, that it would help me a lot, that on that practical grounds it's in my best interest, but that I ought not do it anyway. It's normatively wrong, that we have an obligation to behave as moral agents beyond simply to pursue our own self-interest, and that obligation precedes other matters in terms of significance.
That can get very difficult to do with, depending on how complicated something is, because there are many things working at once in many instances.
Well, I mean, this is where I come back to the issue of what's the core problem for humanity. The core problem for humanity is stubbornness. If you are stubborn on this grounds, there's stubbornness versus pushover. Then it's very important to be stubborn. You need to not be too easily swayed by other people and their opinions, their leverage, or whatever. That it's very valuable for individuals to resist the leverage of others when it goes against their principles. And there's stubbornness versus detachment. On that level, stubbornness is really attachment to the statements that one is affirming. So, and also attachment to them not being dismantled. So, for example, if I say to somebody, okay, well, let me ask you a question. Is blah, 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 and they get the sense that they get some sense that I'm going to walk them down a path where they're trapped. Sometimes they'll be very avoidant about answering that question. To me, that counts as the bad kind of stubbornness that is the source of all humankind's problems.
What about entropy?
Entropy is not...
Doesn't that stuff stubbornness?
Entropy is something upon which none of us have any control. We only have control over one thing, really, and that's our own behavior, and only limited control over that. I'm no determinist. I'm also realistic about the fact that many people are acting out their conditioning, as well as their nature. So,
yeah, like if you're born in North Korea or something.
Right. Oops, god damn it. Make it over that thing. Okay. So this is the case I made to deal with the affirmative case without knowing what it's going to be. I don't know how they're going to affirm the case. They might affirm it at a truth testing level that says compare worlds, the world's better. They might do a compare worlds thing where they say compare worlds, this world with national service would be better than this world without it, our status quo without it. They might do something that says we have a moral obligation to have national service because it affirms communitarianism, which is good, or something like that. They might do any number of different things. What can I do to prevent them from winning the round without knowing what they're going to do? Well, the answer is I came up with a clever discourse, K, that I figured nobody would be prepped for, to say that a nation is not an object of analysis, because in debate, typically everybody treats it as though it were one, even though that's wrong, in my opinion.
You're going so fast.
So, okay, well, I got a lot to cover. I'm going to go do the other side of this right now. And so, then I said, well, implicit in this compulsory national service means there's coercion, so I can critique coercion itself and say, as political agents, we ought not affirm coercive policies. Okay, so that's the neg thing, and I went to attack the AF case. No matter what it is, these things are going to work unless they've got spiked out the discourse K, which nobody did. Nobody runs that kind of shit. You see all these extensions for coercion I have, which are pieces of evidence. And then,
so you always neg it first.
In this instance, I'm giving the neg first because I want to set up what the issues are for the AF to deal with, so you can see how I avoided on the AF. Yeah, for this video, I'm doing it. I don't always negate first. Sometimes I affirm first. Depends what I have a good idea on first.
So would you say that if you actually affirm it or negate it, that's what comes first? Because it cores it.
No, it depends entirely on the wording of the resolution. So, like, this current LD resolution is a descriptive claim. It's not a normative claim. It doesn't have ought or should or things like that. So I treat it differently. Anyway, here's the AF. Affirmative roadmap. I sort of highlight, outline it right there. So, okay, framework. Definition, ought. Ought, used to indicate duty or correctness, used to indicate a desirable or expected state. Definition, compulsory, required by law or rule, obligatory, involving or exercising compulsion. Tag. This is like the first beginning of the case after framing. I affirm the status quo in which all children perform national service called compulsory education. Definition A, national service, a period of compulsory service. Definition B, a federal program that enables young people to pay back government through community work. You'll notice how I highlighted this. It says national service, a period of compulsory service in the armed forces of some countries during peacetime. I didn't read that part. I just highlighted the first part, a period of compulsory service. And then definition B, a federal program that enables young people to pay back government through community work. It actually says government loans, but I didn't read the word loans. So, okay, the point is, it doesn't matter because I didn't misrepresent either of these definitions. I've included parts of them that are additional things, but I didn't misrepresent the fundamental meaning of it in the sense that if it is true that the definition of the period of compulsory service in the armed forces of some countries during peacetime, then it's also true that it's a period of compulsory service. And if it's true that it's a federal program that enables young people to pay back government loans through community work, then it's also true that a federal program that enables young people to pay back government through community work. So because my excisions subsume the more precise definition, this is legal. But if it were the other way around, it wouldn't be. Okay, topicality, learning. Education is widely considered a legitimate form of national service in the status quo. The Corporation for National and Community Service is a federal agency that annually engages millions of Americans in service, analysis. There is no disagreement among those who make or study public policies regarding the legitimacy of education as an expression of national service. In the status quo, student teachers can enter voluntary national service through AmeriCorps and CNCS, and there is broad agreement regarding the positive impact of such service upon the country and the citizenry. Thus, it must additionally be noted that learning is a critical form of national service as well. If to accomplish learning in another is to improve the nation, then the learner as well as the teacher is engaged in national service. Analytic B, consistency. Compulsory education is compulsory national service to which all citizens are subject, provided they reside in the country while classified as a minor, youth. I affirm the status quo in which all children under 16 are required to provide a period of national service called compulsory education. Currently, all children in the United States under 16 are compelled by law to attend school. They are not compensated for this service. Instead, it is understood to be part of their obligation as citizens and the fulfillment of their end of the social contract. And analytic C, burdens. To negate this resolution, then, my opponent must either negate the institution of compulsory education or defeat these ground arguments here made, which establish for the purposes of this round that compulsory education is, in fact, a form of national service. Analytic D, spike rights. Supervenes on consent. To say that an individual has had his rights violated in a way that has any impact under a rights-based framework is to speak of an individual who has the capacity to consent. Children cannot legally consent, thus compulsion of children for their welfare may be understood as coercive but not violating rights. And PMF, prefer my framework. Education is the most important impact in the round. In doing so, members not only, there's a piece of quote here saying how important education is, some bullshit piece of evidence that doesn't matter. Value, thus I value societal welfare. In LD, you're supposed to establish a value on the AF, especially. Value criterion, optimization of individuals through education. Card, Ryan 95. The fact that human nature phenotypically expressed can be either active or passive, constructive or indolent, suggests more than mere dispositional differences and is a function of more than just biological endowment. It always speaks of a wide range of reactions to social environments that is worthy of our most intensive scientific investigation. Specifically, social context catalyzed both within and between person differences in motivation and personal growth, resulting in people being more self-motivated, energized, and integrated in some situations, domains, and cultures than in others. Now, I've used this card many times before to critique education and say we ought to destroy it. But I use it in this instance to say that to just establish inherency, which is to say that there is in fact room for growth here that we can attain through school. The definition actualized equals active, integrated, responsible, self-aware. Contention 1, Gelder, 1983. Compulsory education is key to community and social justice. This appeals to the liberal judges. It links into a bunch of shit I don't agree with, but that people take for granted in debate a lot of times. Contention 1A. Linguistic homogenization is the engine by which cultural unity is attained. This guy, Conversey, 2007. High culture must simultaneously consider itself as the model of human comportment and be the medium of a viable industrial system able to formal skills and articulated in a definite language. A separate high culture develops the industrial need to promote a shared communication tool for whole society. Hence, culture overlaps the communication mode with most of the language. The purpose of this card is if they say something about empowering the dominant elites, I say, no, it's the lack of homogenization in language specifically that causes dominance in the elites. That's what Grace would say in response to that. So this is set up as a sort of spike. It sort of extends ground, gives you more impacts, and it sort of spikes out a possible argument anticipated. Contention 2. Self-determination theory explains how a nation's health supervenes upon education, Ryan 2000A. Regardless of social strata or cultural origin, examples of both children and adults who are apathetic, alienated, and irresponsible are abundant. Such non-optimal human functioning can be observed not only in our psychological clinics, but also among the millions who, for hours a day, sit passively before their televisions or wait listlessly for the weekend to go about their jobs. The persistent, proactive, and positive tendencies of human nature are clearly not invariably apparent. And so, what part did I not read in that card? Stare blankly from the back of their classrooms. This card could be used to turn the arguments that Grace is making. So, the argument she's making is we need education to do these things like self-determination theory. The turn on it is we already have education. We're not doing these things. We're doing the opposite. But I figured that was a opening I'd leave okay because I needed to establish impacts more than I needed to defend against that. If they do collapse that shit, we don't have to defend education. We just have to defend giving the students an additional status than they already have, which, while not better than an ultimate status quo in which we got rid of education, is better than the status quo in which they don't have that status. And so therefore we should affirm. So I'm not too worried about them going down this path, and that's why I include this potentially turnable impact. AT National Service, bad, destined to fail. These are ATs. So if they say like that's, you can't have National Service bad, destined to fail. If they give you generics, they're not going to know what to do with this education case because nobody else is going to be running this. Then then you're going to say, well, AT compulsion bad. Here's a Foucault card, right? This is a neo-Marxist French philosopher who argues for particularist discursive solutions, and he gets conflated into all sorts of political things that he probably wouldn't even agree with. But anyway, Foucaultian notions of discourse can be interpreted in more pragmatic, local, contextual terms as the actual words or talk of organizations during their day-to-day operations. Such talk gives expressions to the meanings and values of an institution, defines, describes, and delimits what is possible, provides the descriptions, rules, permissions, and prohibitions of social and individual action. By using the notion of power within discourse, a postmodern approach to ethical reasoning will be developed, which moves away from the modernist notion of revering principle over context towards a discursive understanding of autonomy, which is concerned with exploring how the notion of choice is actually constructed, understanding discourses which actually create different ways of providing choice, dilemmas after they arise in technologically driven reductionist discourse. An important assumption underpinning such a discussion is the notion that the substantive rationalism of principalism should be challenged by a process of contextualizing problems to issues of power and discourse. Okay, so is it a bunch of fucking garbage? Yeah, it's a bunch of garbage, but it basically says, look, we're promoting we're compelling discourse. We're compelling students to learn the kind of communitarian bullshit discourse that Foucault favors, and the judges probably favor, and the coaches of the debaters probably favor. So, but of course, the thing is, remember, I'm also coaching middle school, so the strongest argument made against this case that Grace told me about was one debater tried to say, basically, you're talking too fancy and nobody understands what you're saying. And I thought that's a pretty strong argument, actually. But
I was about to ask, is there a lot that you're trying to get in a short amount of time? How long's the rounds? Okay, so an LD round, this is a 6-minute opening speech for affirmative. It's a 7-minute opening speech for negative. It's a imbalanced round. So, hi, Abraham.
Hey, do you have an inhaler?
Yeah, there is one, but ask Kimberly.
She said that you guys had it over here.
That's not true.
Okay.
You alright, man?
Oh, here it is. I do have it over here. That is true.
Yeah, I'm good.
Inhale your ass off.
That's okay.
So then, this is the thing about arguing stuff. If you're arguing stuff at all, the first thing you should do is consider the framings of it. Consider what kind of resolution is it. Is it descriptive?
Move my backpack.
This is a white lighter. Is it prescriptive? White lighters are easier on my eyes, so I should buy white lighters from now instead of other colors. Is it normative? Buying white lighters is morally better in some way than buying other color lighters. Or is it predictive? I predict I will buy white lighters from now on. There are 4 kinds of claim, and that's the beginning of any kind of resolutional analysis. And then when you understand what kind of claim they're going to be dealing with and what kind of claim they're going to be affirming, in this case they're going to be affirming a normative claim, you can start to break it down. Well, nation ought to, I mean, nation is, the thing is, on our own definition of normative, it says the state of affairs would be preferable. But we conflated that a little bit, and we said, therefore, we have to have an agent that's taking action that's being affirmed. Therefore, it's the nation state that's being ascribed the role of a moral agent, and that isn't actually what it is. It's a rhetorical device that people utilize to influence other people in some ways or another, or to justify behaviors. So, and then on the affirmative, knowing that possibly that the weakest spots on the neg case were going to be defending compulsion, I produced a variety of compulsory national service that didn't change the amount of compulsion from the status quo. So even if they win compulsion, we're not responsible to eliminate compulsion in education. We can't do that under this resolution. We're just saying let's improve the existing compulsory education by at least affording them the status of you are performing compulsory national service, instead of just affording them the status of, well, you just have to go to school or whatever it is now. So this is how,
Yes.
this is like a good solid example of the actual work of
Is it any good?
trying to figure out how to deal with a given claim that's being asserted, and you have to either affirm it or respond to it. The problem that most people have when they argue is they begin arguing before they do any kind of framework. So they don't go, all right, well, how are we going to define these terms? And we don't go, well, what kind of claim is this? And we don't go, is the claim you're making actually consistent with what you're intending to mean? Or can we come up with some sort of equivalency about what you mean so we can define and pin down what the claim is we're arguing? And then the other issue is everyone needs to not be stubborn. If you get pinned on something, fine. Kick it. Say, okay, fine, I concede that point. And then work with what your new hand is. The problem is people keep trying to deny. They go like, I'm going to pretend I got a royal flush. And you go, but that's not a royal flush. Look, I just knocked out this one, and replaced it with 2 of diamonds, 7 of clubs. And they go, no, it's a royal flush. But that's a 7, right? No. That's a queen of hearts. That is called being stubborn. There's no reason to do that. You're not being asked at any point when you're discussing something to affirm a conclusion that requires you to take action. And if you are, then you need to make sure that distinction is drawn right off the bat. You say, no, I am not agreeing to anything as far as action goes. We are having a conditional only discussion. For the purposes of this conversation, this debate round, this whatever, we agree that these things are defined as such. We both know that in other contexts they're defined differently. But we agree, and that agreement isn't going to change for the duration of this conversation about this topic. And if you said X, then I say, hey, you said X, now you said not X, then you have to kick one of those or lose them both. It's just and fair and reasonable. Remember, at the end, you're going to come to a conditional conclusion. Based on the argumentation we just had, this is the conclusion that is supported, and these conclusions are not supported. And the reason argumentation is the future of mankind is because over time, bad ideas lose over and over again. They just do. The truth wins. The better ideas win. The more sound ideas win. The more consistent ideas win. The more human dignity upholding ideas win. We share an understanding of the good. That is to say, everyone understands that suffering is to be avoided. Suffering is bad, and inflicting suffering on others is evil. Whether they acknowledge those terms or whether they affirm those statements is irrelevant. Everybody understands that to their core because everyone is subject to physical violation. It happened to me the other day when I burnt my finger. I was physically violated by my own stupidity. And it hurt. It still hurts. And I had somebody the other day be like, I began this video about Taylor saying he's 100% a victim, and somebody gave me this relativist bullshit line. He's like, only dumb people deal in absolutes like that, Eric. And I'm like, okay, well, let's take a chainsaw to your face and see how absolute you feel that is. Is it absolute enough for you? There's a failure to distinguish between the metaphysical and physical worlds. When I'm making a claim about Taylor being absolutely 100% a victim, what I'm saying is he bears no metaphysical status of responsibility for the actual harms that he incurred on a physical level. Now, we would all understand those harms are real and concrete if he had had a chainsaw taken to his face. Instead, he was locked up in a cage for 6 months, missing in action, and everyone's like, well, you know, you fuck with the bull, you get the horns, or don't do the crime unless you can do the time. Well, bullshit. Absolutely bullshit.
He's reading this in the beginning.
There is exactly one correct interpretation of that situation. There are exactly one group of people who transgressed and exactly one party who was transgressed upon. Relativism is fine. We do not get to have our own facts, though. We do not get to have our own facts. Taylor is blameless because he did not transgress. Anyway, that's how you argue a bit. I don't know. That's an introductory video. Hopefully it was good. Hopefully you guys liked it. If not, I'll try to do better next time. And thanks for watching.
Talking with Famous People. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.